Jesus said, "Man cannot live on bread alone, but from every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." You're listening to Daily Truth.
In order to properly understand the good news, we must first understand the bad news. Before sin is an action, it is a condition. Psalm 51 verse 5 says this, "Behold," David speaking, "I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Let's pause. In order to understand the good news of God's gracious reconciliation, restoration, salvation, glorification for all of creation, which includes you and I, through the person and work of Jesus Christ, His Son, by grace alone, through faith alone, that is the gospel. In order to understand the brilliance of the diamond, the good news of the gospel, we must properly place it in its context, that is, on the backdrop of the black velvet of sin. We must understand the bad news in order to properly understand the good news. And again, I want to pause here for a moment because many Christians misunderstand this point. The bad news is sin. Let me say that again. And here I'll give a parenthetical disclaimer in addition. The bad news is sin, not the law. The beauty of the gospel of free grace does not shine as good news because of the backdrop of the bad, nasty, mean-spirited law of God. No. You read this book, and it's a pretty easy story to figure out. It's not complicated. If you want to get the headline of the story, of the overarching story and narrative of the Bible, and you want to figure out who the protagonist is, who the enemy is, what's the good news, what's the bad news, what's the hope, what's the problem, with a plain reading of Scripture, you will find undoubtedly that the problem is not the holiness of God. The problem is the sinfulness of man. And yet, many evangelicals treat the law of God as though that were the enemy, rather than our sin. That is the equivalency of treating an MRI as something that gives you a sickness rather than revealing the sickness that's already there. Now that said, I don't trust pretty much 99% of medicine anymore, thanks to all the experts discrediting themselves, so an MRI in objective terms might actually give you sickness. At this point, you know what I mean? There's no conspiracy too far, right? I've run out of conspiracies because in 3 to 6 months, they all come true, right? So I don't know, but just, suspended disbelief for a moment for those of you who are thinking MRI is not a good analogy, Joel. Right? I went down the Reddit hole on this one. Just humor my ignorance for a moment. Let's just assume that that Dr. Fauci's not involved and all that kind of stuff, and assume, what the basic individual thought about MRIs, 20 years ago before everybody, became a mad, evil scientist. Gathering, in Switzerland with George Soros, trying to figure out how to, lower the human population, right? That's going on, sadly. So let's pretend, without that in our minds, that MRIs are good. I don't know. I don't know. Let's just assume for the point of argument. The point is that I'm making the device or procedure or method or person or expert or whatever that reveals a problem is not the problem itself. That's the point that I'm making. In fact, the person or device or method or procedure that reveals the problem is actually a help. That person or method or invention is a blessing to you. And that is the law of God. The law of God does not impute sin. The law of God reveals sin. The problem is not that we have a thrice holy God. The problem is not that he demands that we live in such a way that would garnish our own joy and his glory. That's not the problem. The problem with humanity is not that there is a God in heaven who has rules. The problem for humanity is our own defiance towards that God in heaven. The fact that we hate his rules when left to ourselves. So the problem, the bad news, which is the proper backdrop, the proper context for rightly being able to compare and contrast and appreciate the good news, the bad news is not the law. The bad news is that we are transgressors of the law. The bad news is not God's holiness. The bad news is man's sinfulness.